Well, Gwen John, noswaith dda, a diolch yn fawr iawn, Barry. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation to be here. Thank you, Wynn, for making this happen, and to all of you for joining us for this evening. I must say, a title like R.S. Thomas Dr Rowan Williams does illustrate coming down in the world even more dramatically than what Barry has said. Though I would love to ask Wynn later in the evening why the last chapter is entitled The Case of Rowan Williams. And I'm wondering whether he's using case in the sense of Sherlock Holmes or in the sense of Sigmund Freud. But I'll leave Wynn to comment on that a bit later on. But to explain my title about slowing the metabolism of language. It's a phrase that I took from an Iranian-American poet called Kaveh Akbar, who last year published a collection of poems around the spiritual life. And in his introduction, he says that the purpose of poetry is slowing the metabolism of language. Language pours out of us. And in an age of social media and mass communication, language pours out even more rapidly and, frankly, often stupidly than it does in ordinary conversation. Poetry is language that puts the brake on, that reflects on itself in different ways, that explores its own tensions and irresolutions, sits with its difficulties, and tries, in the light and the energy of all that, to produce something that has a presence, a transforming presence in language. And a great deal of what we say about poetry, I think, has to do with the different ways in which poetic discipline and practice slow us down. Now, I realize there are people who are easily capable of writing poems quickly. Can't say I'm one of them. But it seems to me that whether or not a poem is written quickly, it's read slowly. Read it and then read it again, because you haven't finished it yet. Read it again, and once again, something will reflect back on what's happening and prompt you to take another breath, slow the metabolism, slow down the digestion of the words, so that there's time and opportunity to think again. And it's at that level that poetry becomes not only spiritually and morally, but in an extended sense, I dare to say, politically important. The language that surrounds us, the language we use and are used by a lot of the time, is so frequently not only rapid but manipulative. Writing and reading poetry is, I would say, one of the techniques that saves us from being too easily manipulated by language. It makes us more deeply aware of what we're saying, what subtexts are, what the hidden connections are that poetry seeks to bring to the surface. And that's the slowing down, and that's the spiritual practice. As you'll have gathered by now, if you've looked outside, I edited a book last year called A Century of Poetry, which was subtitled Poems for Searching the Heart. And that subtitle was an attempt to avoid talking about religious poems or even spiritual poems, but suggesting that these were poems which would slow you down, which would make you ask questions of yourself in certain ways, and which in that way would stop you being manipulated, stop you taking for granted what was being said, and introduce you to a deeper and fuller level of how language works. So when I speak of poetry as spiritual discipline, it's something of that I have in mind. So just a word or two to begin with about the two ends of that, the spiritual discipline of the poet and the spiritual discipline of the reader. From the poet's point of view, it's a very curious process that goes on in the composition of any work. People occasionally say, so do you set aside a period every day for writing poetry? And I know some people do, but again, I don't, because I tend to find that poetry walks in when it wants to, and it's a bit difficult to book the times for it. It doesn't make appointments. And that can mean, very, very occasionally, as I've sometimes put it, that a poem walks in almost finished, sits down on the sofa and puts its legs up on the table, and you think, where did that come from? And there are the other occasions when a line or two arrives, and you think, where does that belong? What comes before and after? I don't know. I've got to listen very hard to that line and let it kind of marinate for a bit. And maybe, after weeks or months, and perhaps a couple of long train journeys, something may emerge, or not. Looking occasionally at old notebooks, I find abandoned scraps of poetry and think, that was a line that never found its home. Maybe it will, I don't know. I haven't really tried, but there we are. It's possible. But it's that sense of, on the whole, listening for the moment when something arrives, spending the time that's needed to listen so that you pick up and know how to negotiate the bumps in the road, the tensions, the contradictions, and sometimes the cliches. Sometimes on a second reading of a poem you've drafted, you can think, that line is a cliche. I didn't know what to say, so I took a shortcut. All poets do that. You just have to keep on the watch for it and make sure it doesn't take over. And unless you do a bit of worrying about that, I think you're going to be a very inadequate poet. It's not that you'll get it right, but it's important to worry. Think of that wonderful joke about the Welsh mother who sends a telegram in the old days to her son saying, "Start worrying, details to follow." So you worry about whether you're relying on cliches, whether you're building bridges, ready-made bridges that don't really connect things. And keeping that worry alive is part of it, and part of the slowing down. And it means that as a writer, you have to keep your ear open, and it is really your ear, to what is and isn't working. And you may find years later that you've thought something worked and it manifestly doesn't. It's a bit late now because you've let the thing out into the world. You've brought up your children and you've let them go and they've got jobs of their own now. So with a poem. But what about the reader? Geoffrey Hill, one of my great heroes and, if I dare to say it, something of a friend and critic in his later years, Geoffrey Hill liked to make a great deal of what he was most often criticized for, which was being difficult. Geoffrey's line was basically, well, of course it's difficult. What do you think? That's poetry for you. It's meant to be difficult. And difficulty is what gives us energy, scope, and the capacity to grow. I don't find Geoffrey's poetry any easier than most of his readers, but he's inviting you to spend time. He's inviting you not to come to a point where you look at a poem and say, well, I think I've got it now. The best response to a good poem is never to say, I've got it now, but to be able to say, now I know it's worth going back to. So it's a kind of recursive, reflexive thing. Again, slowing down the metabolism. You don't devour the poem like a hamburger. It's not fast food, it's the verbal equivalent of slow food. You chew it, you digest it. And it's fascinating to me that that imagery of chewing the cud of the word is one that's used by a lot of medieval writers when they describe reading the Bible. St. Bernard talks about chewing the cud of Scripture, regurgitating and redigesting. It's a rather grotesque, but I think you'll agree, quite vivid image of what it's like to read intently. And good poetry encourages that, which is one reason for thinking that among all the other things you might say about the Bible, it's quite good poetry too. You keep going back to it. And it challenges the ease with which you think you're getting on top of things, the ease with which you think you're getting on top of the world. Because what if the world is not something to be got on top of, but something to negotiate with, to work with, to allow to impact on you, to invite you to participate in its processes and its energies, so that the words that come out renew the face of the earth, to use another good classical analogy from Scripture. And when I'm occasionally asked, what does it mean to be a priest who writes poetry, there are some rather more distinguished examples around, I do frequently say it is very much to do with an attitude to language that's common both to the ministry and the theology of priesthood and to the practice of poetry. Because if you have a responsibility for the word with a capital W, it actually does something to how you think and feel about words in other contexts too. So that's a very general explanation of how I think about the poetic as slowing the metabolism, how I see it as part of resisting the verbal equivalent of fast food, how I see it as a spiritual discipline and an opportunity for heart searching. That in itself is a slightly somber picture of poetry, you might say. And it's certainly not that poetry is never celebratory. But even in celebration, even in the praise poetry that characterizes so many global poetic traditions, not least the Welsh one, even there, the words are meant to slow you down. They may pour out, but nonetheless, they pour out with a newness that makes you see and hear afresh what they're about. And another of the jobs I've taken on in recent years, as again you probably know, is translating, along with Gwyneth Lewis, the book of Taliesin, the 14th century manuscript in the National Library in Aberystwyth, which represents at least 600 years of poetic tradition, possibly even longer. A collection in which celebratory poetry and a poetry of, as it were, ecstatic entering into the processes of the world around is central to that poetic rhetoric. Now, although you've been told that I'm going to be giving a lecture, that's really all I want to say by way of generality. Because before we move on to the conversation with Wynn, and I'm still waiting for an answer on the case of Rowan Williams, I'll just share with you a couple of examples or poems which might just illuminate what I've been saying and which might make better sense in the light of what I've said. And so here's one from the book of Taliesin. For those not familiar with the book of Taliesin, it's worth saying that this is in many ways a puzzling, even a baffling collection. It contains very many archaic elements which are extremely hard to decode, let alone translate. It also contains quite a lot of poems about poetry. And one of my favorites is this one. In the original Old Welsh, it's called Bjarth y Beirdd, which I've translated because I couldn't resist it as Poet's Corner. And it's, like several of the poems in the Taliesin collection, a polemic. The persona of a lot of the later Taliesin poems from, let's say, the 12th through early 13th century, the persona is of a flamboyant, boastful, aggressive, witty character whose main themes are the glory of the natural world, the incompetence of every other poet, and the particular incompetence of the clergy. My guess is that this Taliesin figure comes from a context of very traditional bardic scholarship, which, of course, was part of a traditional clerical identity in the older Wales, up against the new world of theology and church discipline that came in with the Norman settlements in Wales and the Benedictine monasteries created in Wales and the Norman bishops imposed on Welsh dioceses, about whom Taliesin has nothing good to say. But this is particularly addressed to other incompetent poets, and it's got a wonderful sequence of images of verbal futility, which I hope you'll enjoy. A time of sifting and of pondering, for British poets with pointless verses. My own great strength, my own great standing, give dismay to the chorus of poets. I'm a rod for the back of the poet's efforts, the poet's corner where the amateurs sit. 15,000 of them struggling to get it straight. I'm a seasoned singer of splendid songs, sharp and hard, a shaman, a sage, a skilled artisan, a serpent, a seduction, greedy for nourishment. I'm not struck dumb. I'm not going to stammer. When singers sing what they've learned by heart, no miracle they work will leave me beaten. Contending with me, their fate will be like dressing yourself when you have no hands, like diving lakes when you know you can't swim. The thundering flood flows on without fear, its high tumult to terror for homesteads, but above the wave, by God's plan, stands a rock. The enemy's refuge is dark and fearful, but that rock is the high king, the judge of all, the Lord who will make us drunk with delight. I'm a cell, I'm a splinter, I'm a shapeshifter, a library of song, a sanctuary for the reader. I love wooded slopes, I love warm shelters, I love real poets who don't buy reputations. I don't love those who live by argument, and mockers of poetry will merit no wealth. But now it's time to take up arms, along with those skilled in the arts of verse, against the cack-handed fiddling of my foes. That sounds like marching without feet to war, like planning to travel without any feet, like gathering nuts where there aren't any trees, like hunting for boars in the upland heather, like ordering a raid without uttering a sound, like an army of soldiers with no one in command, like feeding the needy with scrapings of skin, like a badger rootling in the ruins of houses, like catching the air with a farmyard hook, like thistles that can't be bothered to draw blood, like a light that you show to a man who's blind, like a naked man giving clothes away, like pouring out foam along the seashore, like feeding fish on a diet of milk, like covering a hall with a roof of leaves, like using twigs to trim your cudgel, like dissolving Dyfed with a single word. I'm the bard of the hall. I'm the lad in the chair. I make poets stutter when they speak. And before I'm laid in a comfortless grave, may we all find room in your house, Mary's son. I've often been puzzled by writers who get praised for never wasting a word. And here's a little thing of my own called Never Wasting a Word. Never ransacking the tins piled in the bunker for the final war, so that we shan't find ourselves silent in the dark. Never producing the tough plastic mass that won't biodegrade and can't be used again, squatting triumphantly under the squawking gulls. Never leaving visible on the plate the stuff that you can't swallow, stuff they'd be grateful for in Hungary somewhere else. Never spending scarce cash on the unnecessary, unswallowable, unrecyclable, unprocessable, once-only offer, or what? There's a little sequence of poems which I wrote in honour of one of my great poetic heroes in Wales, Dr Williams, on whom Wynn has a brilliant chapter in his new book, absolutely wonderful chapter. And this little sequence called From Carningley contains one poem called Exit Tax. The western shore is what the left eye sees, where the headlands of the senses join up into one frontier. I am a body, this is an island. Furious or still, what sits on the foreign side has no words in common. Shores where day ends, light is pinched out, where the hand feels in vain for a wall, not there, and the foot misses the stair. The west is where the dead sail, the blistered slopes, the cloth-smooth pastures, the beds of the Burns unit, waiting for the drop into sleep and water. In the left eye's landscape, some futures are not possible. The ones where I rehearse the deaths of strangers, where I sit back, president of a tribunal, where all the questions have been silenced and all the enemies are underfoot. The eye of the headlands opens wide, and foreign tongues from the neighbouring darkness sound in curlew cries of mockery. Nothing is owed to futures of terror. Better to write on the cell walls a few green words that the left eye can recognize. Good news. The only tax you have to pay is death. Not fear, not insurance, not obedience. And a third, rather frivolous, just called Pool. It's about tadpoles. A twig breaks. Promptly, obligingly staging the haiku, one or two new frogs plop in the water. Where their younger kin lie or skitter, hundreds and hundreds of fat commas swept from the compositor's workbench into the sandy shallows, hundreds of little fat breathing pauses in the water's dull paragraph. When their breath has pumped up shiny eyes and limbs, they will wait too, throbbing by the pond's edge, listening for the crack of danger, for the dry foot of this uncertain upper world that no one had predicted, back when it all was wet, long, soundless clauses between the wriggle of black breath, ready to leap from this new purgatorial height back into steady dark, away for a while at least, from the terrors of what the sun sucks upwards. Green, limbs, lungs, even words or wings. Thank you very much.
First thing is to ensure that everybody can hear us. Can you hear us okay? You may not want to, but can you hear us?
Same with this one.
Good. Excellent, okay. Well, diolch yn fawr iawn I chi. Ever since 2013, I've wanted to get Rowan back to Swansea, and along with Barry, and I'd like to thank Barry as well for the introduction. That was the occasion, of course, of RS's centenary, and we had a three-way discussion that drew large crowds, and therefore I knew Rowan was a crowd puller. And it was a terrific event, and people still remember it, so I've long wanted to have you back. And as you know, that book of mine, don't worry, I'm not going to talk about that, but that book of mine, it does align you, so to speak, with poets in the spiritual tradition in Wales. And one of those whom you mentioned is R.S. Thomas. And I particularly like the elegy you wrote for R.S. So would you mind reading it? And maybe just saying, yes, it's there for you, look, and then saying a few words about just a word about it, okay?
Thank you. Well, thank you. This is an elegy. It's called Death Ship, in memory of R.S. Thomas. The last years, words from a window smoothing the sea, the iron back and forth to probe the fugitive wrinkles, carving a path down to the lost gate. What hid in the pale clefts till now feels for the light, a soft, uncertain fingering, as if through stone, through furrows of flint. The tides pressed neat as for an evening out. Time to drag down a black boat from the shed, off through the gate, to balance on the slow sea at dark, ready to sail. The smoke will rise, the cloudy pillar wavering across the sky's long page. At dawn, Somewhere westward, the boat flares in a blaze of crying birds. Three or four things that go into that, I suppose. The primary image is the death ship of the Vikings. You lay the Viking chieftain on the ship, you push it out to sea, set fire to it, and off it drifts. That was the first thing. I couldn't really resist the image of Wynn Thomas as a kind of Viking heavyweight, because there was something pretty sort of axe-wielding about him at times, as we all know. But the second thing that weaves itself in there was that sense in the last poems that he published before his death, the sense again and again of this presence looking out of the window at the sea, not just at the storms, but also at the calm. So the image that came there was ironing, smoothing out, to probe the fugitive wrinkles, I said. So that was in there as well. And then, of course, R.S. as birdwatcher, and the blaze of crying birds at the end as a sort of appropriate way of thinking of what comes at the end of that life. And yes, you picked it up in your comment on the poem when the cloudy pillar wavering across the sky's long page. Let the fiery cloudy pillar guide me all my journey through. The line from Pantacellin, and behind that the biblical image of the pillar of cloud leading. Cloud because it's a clouded poetics all the way along, and fiery too. But the wavering across the sky's long page, a sense of a column of cloud down the page. So all of that's going on, I think, somewhere in the
Were
poem.
you remembering that, of course, his father was a ship's captain, a master mariner,
yes.
and that R.S. himself never really felt happy far from the sea.
That's right.
And sea watching, which is one of the poems, by the way, you include in that
This collection, yes.
in that collection, don't you? Is perhaps his best, or one of them, certainly. So there's all of that there somehow as well, whether consciously or subliminally, I don't know. But that for me is what made it such a rich poem. Now you say it actually, so you can't deny it. It's there in black and white, this statement. I dislike the idea of being a religious poet. Stop somebody in their tracks, isn't it? Well, I would prefer to be a poet for whom religious things mattered intensely. What's the difference?
A religious poet sounds to me like a kind of sub-department of poetry. There's poetry and then there's religious poetry. It's a bit like you see it a lot in bookshops in the United States, and you're beginning to see it here a bit. You have a crime section, and you have next to it a cozy thrillers section. And I sometimes feel that poetry and religious poetry are like crime and cozy thrillers. You just have to be a bit careful how you handle that. So I'd rather not be living in a subsection like that. A poet for whom religious things matter intensely, well, obviously, in a sense, I'm a priest, I'm a believer, and that's central to all that I am. But to say it's central is to say there's quite a lot else going on. And therefore that's a resource, that's a source out of which perspectives come that light up other things, but they don't always have to be marked explicitly, and they don't have to be given a sort of official nihil obstat. So I think that's the kind of difference I'm after.
Would it also be that no, let me start differently. You're a real poet. That is, you're the real thing, right? In my opinion. But in my opinion. But it's important to say that, because I was sceptical to begin with. Okay? And I was sceptical because lots of clergy who write poetry really only write theology in verse. And it strikes me that you've always been very wary and chary of that, that poetry's got nothing to do with ideology or with dogma or theology in that sense, which is interesting because you're a great theologian. So it's interesting how, on the one hand, you're this I think, fine poet, and you're also, of course, one of the world's leading theologians. So would you like to talk about that?
Well, thank you for the assessment.
Not everybody agrees, man.
Not everybody agrees, no. There's a wonderfully rude review of this by William Logan.
Oh, yes, okay. Yeah, okay.
Some people know, obviously.
Struck home, did it?
Oh, yeah, and he said of what I'd published that it was the kind of thing that Dons write on holiday. And I think he also referred to some rather grim North American Roman Catholic prelate who'd written a novel. And Logan said, you don't expect archbishops to write novels or poems, and it's not really surprising when they're so awful when they're published. So, yeah, it stings. But Michael Schmidt, who was my editor at Cardiff, very kindly said of William Logan that he'd never written either a good review or a good poem, so that that sort of relieved me. So, okay, yes, whinge is over. Back to the question. Poetry just does not work like theology because it's not exposition.
No.
It's not about ideas. It starts with the image, it starts with the sound, and it has to lead where it leads. Mm. And that's why I think it's entirely right and proper that poets who happen to be believers may write poems that are deeply challenging in theological terms, and don't just settle down with the standard replies. Now you see it at work, obviously, in a slightly different way in George Herbert, where I've sometimes said that one of George Herbert's great techniques in his poetry is to put his foot on the accelerator and drive straight for the cliff edge and then swerve at the last moment. Mm. Mm. So his last lines are like, a guillotine coming down. And as I raved and grew more fierce and wild with every word, methought I heard one calling child. And I replied, my lord. And that's it. And Herbert does push the boundaries in that way, as, of course, do Auden and Eliot and Geoffrey Hill and others. And I think sometimes it's a mark of a good poem by a believing poet, that you might be able to read it and not guess their theological affiliations, which is why in this book there are poems by, as I said in the introduction to it, poems by very orthodox believers like T.S. Eliot and Les Murray, and there are poems by people whose affiliations are very obscure, and there are poems like Saunders Lewis's Prayer at the Frontier, by someone who would have described himself as an Orthodox Catholic believer, and of course did, in response to Dewi Phillips's analysis of that poem. And yet, the poem itself leaves you in a very bleak place indeed.
You got that because it's a great poem, isn't it?
It's a fantastic poem.
I mean, he wrote it when he was 80 years old,
I know, yes.
So he was writing about the experience that he saw on the horizon.
Yes,
It is, well, you'll explain, Gwydir Terfyn.
Gwydir Terfyn. How do you translate that?
I leave it to you.
Well, I wrote in the commentary on this how to translate the title. Terfyn, like its Latin parent terminus, can mean end, goal, limit, boundary, frontier. Prayer at the limit would capture something of it. Yes, but the translation...
Is it your translation, or is it
the
Joseph Clancy one?
It's the Joseph Clancy one. Okay. And because he settled for prayer at the end, I settled with that. So here's Gwydir Terfyn. It's an experience that everyone has that nobody else will know. Each on his own, in his own way, owns his own dying. Through the millions of years of the human race. You can look at it, you can sometimes recognize the moment. You cannot empathize with anyone at that moment when the breathing and the person stop together. And then, nothing reaches out to the then, but a prayer groping. Such a sorry creature is man, such a baby his imagination. In my Father's house there are many mansions. As poor as our own, just as much earthbound, his intuition too, in the days when he emptied himself. And only this way can we ourselves picture hope. He is seated on the right hand of God the Father Almighty, a general hailed with jubilation through the city of Rome after the hazardous enterprise in the Persia of creation, and crowned as Augustus, co-Augustus with his father. How laughable the supreme assertions of our faith. And around us remain silence and the pit of annihilation into which our universe will soundlessly fall some night. Our words cannot trace the borders of silence or say God with meaning. One prayer remains for all, to go silently to the silent.
Reminds me, Emily Dickinson is one of the poets, I think is quite astonishing. And she talks, she says somewhere that to multiply the harbours does not reduce the sea. And I think that's spot on. And it's close to what you're talking about there, isn't it?
Wonderful, yes.
That you can seek as many refuges as you like, including in a poem. And in the end, you're still faced with it, which is what C.S. Lewis is saying.
Yes,
And Dickinson also says something else, which seems to me to chime with what you've been talking about. She talks about the importance for her of, the word is dwelling, a terrific word in English, isn't it? Dwelling in possibility. Dwelling in possibility. That is, keeping all sorts of possibilities in play. And that seems to me something that poets live by. That's the opposite, isn't it, of dogma and theology, if you pardon my putting it like that. But
well, we could argue about that because I think that
good dogmatic language does exactly that.
It's about dwelling in possibility, but that's another story. But I know what you mean. It's certainly the opposite of a certain kind of closure, a certain kind of certainty. And I like the dwelling thing because I think, again, what a good poem will do is keep doors open. And will show, even in that very dark poem where he's saying, the language that comes most easily to us as believers is as childish as anything else when the chips are down. And we're all still looking into something we cannot, absolutely cannot map. And, well, live there, dwell there. Is that going to paralyze you, or is that going to invite you? And I think the poet's job is to say it doesn't have to paralyze you.
It's something I've always been aware of as a teacher, but again, I don't want to spend time on that, but how to convey to students that poems are not there to be nailed down, that what they are is an invitation to dwell in possibility, and therefore that's why the element of play is important in maths and so on. But I won't stop on that. Let me take you back and wonder for a minute of something you said. The point is, I'm easily seduced by what you say, okay? Because I'm very much in sympathy with it. And I recognise it as what you're saying as being true of the kinds of poetry you select, you talk about, and it's also the poetry I like, as so happens. But then I wonder. I wonder about Pope. I wondered about Dryden, great poets, who unfortunately today are forgotten. One of the great poems in English for me is Byron's Wicked Don Juan. Astonishing poem, okay? And I remember too something that you did touch on there. There's a long quarrel between poets and clerics, isn't there?
That is.
And to use your favourite poet, Wynn Thomas, after the funeral, right? Now, I've read that, I think I'm quite right, as a challenge to the power of the minister. He's waging a war of words over who controls the words, okay? Because he says within there that I'm Anne's bard on a raised hearth, okay? And he says, this is what I speak from, this is what I speak as. And he contrasts that with the mule praises and so on, that those actually of the minister conducting the service. Now, do you make enough allowances for all that? That poetry is not poetry, it's poetries. It's different kinds of poetry.
Yes.
Don't you think?
Oh, there's several questions there, I think. Let's start with Dryden and Pope and all of that. One of the things that I think has to be recognised as really interesting about a great Augustine like Pope is that the tightness of the structure, the neatness of it, is deceptive because
it is.
Underneath through that, something else is going on. If you think of something like even the essay on man, which is It's, not one of my favourites, the Dunciad.
Yeah.
With its beautifully polished shape.
And that ending,
the ending, universal darkness, yes.
Which I keep thinking about whenever I look at the direction of Westminster, okay?
Yeah.
Westminster politics. You remember the end of the Dunciad, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah. The hand, O Anarch, lets the curtain fall, and universal darkness covers all. Sums it all up, really, doesn't it?
Yes.
Sorry, I cut across you.
No. It's worth reminding people of these things. Yeah, so I'd say that the tension of great Augustan poetry is that tension between the, if you like, the unbridled human agenda that it's dealing with, and the sheer challenge of getting into that sort of form.
Yeah.
Byron's another good example there, and one of the most extraordinary things about Byron is exactly that fusion of the deeply subversive with the almost prim neatness of the style.
Yeah.
And I think it's actually one of the things that somebody like Auden understands in some of his work, that's what he's doing as well. So I'm all for recognising poetries, and I realise that it's easy to take for granted, if you like, that the norm is some sort of freer or more obviously unresolved stuff. Different things are going on. And having mentioned Herbert, again, a poet of formal beauty and grace to a great extent, and yet some extremely earthquake stuff going on under the surface. So there's that. And then Dylan Thomas and the Minister. Yes, I think it's fair enough that there is a contest going on here, and that in the broadest sense, any religious teacher who sees their job as controlling what the word generates has misunderstood it. Any religious teacher who thinks that the point is to let the word generate words in different directions perhaps knows their business rather better. I think of a John Donne or a Lancelot Andrews.
Yes.
These are people whose witness in preaching and poetry to the word with a capital W is one that really does trigger great chains of image and sometimes quite bold and tension-filled prose as well as poetry.
That anthology that you've just brought out before Christmas, yes, which I've read with pleasure, not least because about 10% of the poets are Welsh poets. Was that deliberate? Because it's for me, of course, it's a vindication of my argument in the book that really you're very much in that line of descent spiritually. Is that fair?
It's fair, yes. It was deliberate, but deliberate in the sense that I was, as I say in the introduction, I was really just choosing the poems that meant something, that had played a role. Also, 10% of the poetry in here is Jewish.
Yes.
20th century Jewish, because it seemed to me it was quite impossible to think about any poetry for searching the heart in the modern era without giving that kind of space to the Jewish voice.
Yes.
And not just the Jewish voice about the Holocaust either, because there are poems here from Israeli poets who are approaching things from a different angle. One of the poems here by, I think, Yehuda Amichai, about Abraham and Isaac, called The Real Hero, was almost certainly written as part of a sort of protest against conscription in the Lebanon War. Amichai was an impeccable Zionist, but he believed that Zionism was being used at that point, if you like, to serve the interests of a particular political agenda. And so he has this astonishing poem in which he says the real hero in the story of Abraham and Isaac is the ram.
Yes.
Nobody asks the ram what it wants, it just gets sacrificed. That's what happens in wars.
Yeah, it's terrific, isn't it? Amichai came here to Swansea in '95. Karen, I remember his reading in Dylan Thomas Centre. It was very impressive indeed, I must say. Yes, so to go back from it to the Welsh poetical tradition. And one thing I do say in my book is that it seems to me to be somewhat unusual, in fact, if you think of the poetic traditions of some of the great Western countries over the last century or so. I mean, the virtual disappearance, the erasure of the spiritual is a marked feature of it. And then you've got this peculiar feature of Welsh poetry. And you yourself turn to Iris Bowen, you turn to Wynn Thomas, although I think he's a religious poet, but you think he's a religious poet, I know that. Vernon Watkins, Ruth Bidgood, Gwen John, of course, is an extraordinary poet, electrifying poet, Waldo Williams, etc. All these you're very familiar with. I couldn't explain it in my book, as I admitted, why there is this tradition. I don't think the fact of the presence of the chapels can explain it, do you? I don't know. No. Can you think of an explanation?
I wish I could. I can't come up with any neat account of that. But interesting that in different ways, in all these, almost all of these that you mentioned, especially Gwen, to some extent Waldo, even Iros, there's a very deep sense of immediacy about the situation of a people and a culture under profound pressure.
That's true. That's true.
And that's where I compare it just a bit with the extraordinary flow of religious poetry from Poland and Russia in the 20th century. Because if you want to find analogues, you've got to look to the other end of Europe, I think.
Yeah.
Where you, and not to mention, of course, the Jewish writers I mentioned. But if you look at the great Polish and Russian voices of the last, say, 50 to 60 years, you cannot get away from the agenda of faith.
That's
in the same way.
I see your point.
I've actually just finished translating a sequence of poems by Larissa Miller, who's a prominent Russian poet, some of whose work has been translated. And she, in the last 12 months, she's been writing on her blog a sequence of short poems connected with the Ukraine war, of which she is a very courageous and fierce and public critic. And I'm not quite sure what Larissa's personal religious view is. She's Jewish by background, but the title of the sequence, as I've rendered it, is "Creator, We Need an Answer." And it's there's a very strong interweaving of religious and critical and skeptical themes in it.
That's a very good point, and there's a lot of that in Welsh poetry, isn't there?
I think so.
Which brings me to the obvious question, Rowan. You were a good chapel boy.
What went wrong?
What went wrong? I mean, you're really nothing but a chapel boy gone to the bad, you know.
I know.
So how? It's a long journey from that, not only to the Anglican communion, but in fact to the Eastern Orthodox Church, which I know is very attractive to you, isn't it? Which I'd also like you to talk about a little, you know.
Well, I started attending a church in Wales congregation, I suppose, when I was about 11 or 12. We just moved house, and the local chapel wasn't actually very interesting. And, well, I hope, David, you won't mind my saying this, but your father, who was my parish priest, was and still is to me an inspirational figure, and he gave me so much that I still treasure and is still absolutely basic to my life and my understanding and my faith. And I found there a wealth of human sympathy and imaginative energy, let's say, and the worship and the teaching. That's nice. I've just stuck with it.
Oh, thank you. I should explain, because it must be strange to see that image up there and not have it explained. That is actually, of course, the image on the cover of your collection. What interests me is every time it's reproduced, it's like a different colour. It's very strange, that, isn't it? But you know, it's Gwen John, of course.
Gwen John.
And for me, that's a terrific image. I mean, that was my favourite painting. And it seems to me, looking at it, you realise she's the Vermeer of Wales, isn't she?
Yes, absolutely.
I mean, there is that extraordinary sense of stillness of silence. He captures what Walt Whitman talked about when he talked about trying to capture the way that a light falls about a helpless thing. The way that light falls about a helpless thing. And she gets it, doesn't she?
Totally.
You also write a poem about Gwen John, or if that is a sequence you call it, don't you?
Yes.
So say a quick word about that.
Well, she's been an artist I've loved and admired colossally for most of my adult life, I suppose, and it's exactly that point about how the light falls.
Yeah, I thought it would be.
And the way in which she conveys a sort of density of light, you know, a grainy, thick light, which is also, you know, it's not lumpy, it's not dazzling, but it's
even, isn't it?
It's even. I compare it to Vermeer, yes, but also Bellini's Ecstasy of St. Francis in the Frick collection in New York, where you have a sort of early evening light falling across a long landscape, and something of the same quality. So there's that. But also when I read Susan Rowe's very good biography of Gwen John some years ago, bits of her life, the complicated and marginal abusive relationship with Rodin, as you know, the master who clearly regarded it as part of the job to seduce his sitters. The images that keep coming back when she writes those poems about the family of Thérèse of Lisieux, and when she does that sequence of sketches and little paintings of girls in church, which you can see in the National Museum in Cardiff. I wanted to pick up those. And then the opening image of the sequence, simply the self-portrait on the cover of Susan Rowe's biography. This very sort of austere, neat, round-headed figure with tightly parted hair. And I thought, Mrs. Noah, from an old Noah's Ark set, you know, rather stiff figure. And I thought, what about Gwen John as Mrs. Noah? That's how it started.
Right, sorry, Elaine, I'm overrunning, but then and we need to allow just a minute or two for questions. But can I ask you at the very end, kind of a pop question, so to speak, okay? The equivalent of Desert Island Discs, you know. If you were landed on that desert, as they say, then if you choose one poet, which one? By the way, if I were asked this question, I'd be lost. So I pardon it if you say pass. But one poet that you would choose, and then maybe even that's not necessarily by the same poet, but one poem.
I was asked this question actually some years ago, and the answer I gave then, and probably would still give, is Auden's collected poems. Not because I think Auden is the greatest poet, but because when I read,
He's slick. He's glib.
Oh no!
Yes, he is. Isn't he?
Oh no, he isn't. I'd say that because it was when I was reading Auden in my 20s that I learned about discipline in writing. Because Auden, you may say slick, but discipline is what I see in him.
Okay.
He knows how to do the stuff. He knows how to make words work carefully. And it's. I think what I'm trying to say is that when I read him, I feel challenged to write more carefully, with more attention, more discipline. Right. Not, as I say, because I think he is greater than some of these others. But,
right. Interesting.
Come on, go back to the Bonhoeffer poem in here. Is that slick? I don't think it's slick.
No. He had his moments, you know. But okay,
and a single poem.
Yes.
Well, impossible, really.
I know.
I found myself at a conference recently when we had an evening of reading and entertainment, reciting from memory Eliot's Journey of the Magi, because that goes very, very, very deep. But, you know, Causley's Eden Rock is one that very simple poem that I find it unbearably moving.
Thank you very much.